Hello, cybersecurity risk enthusiasts. My name is Boyden Rohner, and I'm the Associate Director for Vulnerability Management at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, or CISA. For those of you who aren't familiar with CISA, we are the nation's risk advisor. As the nation's risk advisor, we endeavor to understand cyber and physical risks to the nation's critical infrastructure and help partners strengthen their own capabilities. So naturally, we are very interested in the topic of cyber risk and cyber risk management programs. Therefore, it's my pleasure to bring to you the insights of three highly regarded leaders in the cybersecurity field who are experts at cyber risk management and cyber risk management programs. Our first panelist is Lisa Donnan, partner at Option 3 Ventures, a mission-driven cybersecurity private equity fund. She is widely recognized in the information and telecommunication security circles as a new business whisperer. And when it comes to cyber warfare, Lisa has been at the forefront of successfully commercializing innovative and disruptive technologies. She's launched new businesses and been credited for creating new markets in both the public and private sectors. With over 25 years of experience, Lisa is recognized as a thought leader in cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, social media data analytics. And through the course of preparing for this panel with Lisa, I learned that we are practically neighbors living just a couple miles apart in Loudoun County, Virginia, and that she has ridden in an elevator with Paul Newman and Tom Cruise. Of course, this was before COVID when we did things like ride in elevators with other people. And like all the panelists today, she is a parent, which means she deserves a gold medal for this year leading a family through a pandemic. And she has two college-bound twin children. Congratulations on all those things, Lisa.
Thank you, Boyden.
Our second panelist is Alma Cole, Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection within the Department of Homeland Security. With more than 60,000 employees, U.S. Customs and Border Protection is one of the world's largest law enforcement organizations and operates and maintains an astounding amount of diverse technology. Think biometric readers, those kiosks at the airports, and fixed and mobile surveillance systems such as towers and even aerostats, which is a fancy word for blimps if you weren't familiar. He is responsible for all aspects of CBP's cybersecurity program to include security architecture, risk management, policy compliance, and defensive operations. If Alma's background didn't convince you that he's got one of the coolest jobs in cybersecurity, I'd like to let you know that he's exactly the one that you want covering your Security 6. For example, if you head on over to YouTube or Instagram, you'll find out that Alma has a very avid following of Instagram followers for his sports shooting award-winning career. Welcome, Alma.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Lastly, our third panelist is Shaun Khalfan, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Discover Financial. Fun fact, Shaun preceded Alma as the Chief Information Security Officer at Customs and Border Protection. Shaun is a risk reduction expert who has led company-wide risk reduction efforts for companies that are pillars of the global economy, such as Freddie Mac and Barclays. If you've ever had a mortgage, there's a good chance Shaun's been responsible for keeping it safe. And when not busy keeping your money safe, Shaun finds time to be on the board of the Financial Services Information Sharing Analysis Center, to be an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and he also happens to be an Army combat veteran. So hooah to you, Shaun. We are lucky to have Shaun here today, not just because of his cybersecurity risk management expertise, but he's days away from being a father for the second time. When I asked Shaun what his fun fact was for the panel today, he mentioned that he used to be a fast runner, which is totally understandable with all that you have going on today. So welcome, Shaun.
Thank you, Boyden. Glad to be here.
Right. All right. So to those of you in the audience, we're looking forward to responding to some questions that you might have for us. So head on over to the chat and post a question, and we'll be responding those in real time as we work through our recorded questions today. So we can all agree with the premise that effective cybersecurity depends on a mature approach to risk management. In fact, cybersecurity effectiveness is bounded by an organization's ability to manage risk. So let's get our panelists' perspective on what's working and what's not when it comes to cybersecurity risk management. Lisa, I want to start with you. In your role as a venture capitalist, you have a unique opportunity to roll up your sleeves and get up close and personal with companies trying to bring their technologies to market. I'm going to hazard a guess there's probably companies like that here in the audience today. I want to know, are you talking to these companies about cyber risk management? And if so, what are some of the themes that you're hearing?
Thank you, Boyden. With nearly $40 billion of investment going into cybersecurity just this year from private equity and venture capital, obviously we see cyber risk management as a business issue versus an IT issue. And cybersecurity is all we do at Option 3. And so our portfolio companies understand cyber risk management. These are software companies that are solving for complex issues, whether that be in industrial controls, automotive. And so they design and develop with security in mind. They're using zero trust architectures. They're leveraging the NIST cybersecurity framework. And, at the end of the day, it comes down to people, process, and tech. And so they know the actions that they need for each of these. Interesting, though, the themes I see correlate to the rise in attacks on private equity, venture capital, and our portfolio companies. They see us as target rich, the adversaries, and they view our investments as confirmation that there's value. And of course, we verify this with the press release, highlighting the fact that we just invested in these for the obvious reasons. And so it's pretty easy to follow the breadcrumbs. So you are definitely seeing cyber risk more in M&A, due diligence of possible investments, and then an ongoing portfolio management. And as we all know, these cyber attacks are not going away anytime soon. So you're going to see more, cyber risks, cyber controls, resiliency are going to be even more prevalent.
Great. So Shaun, in contrast to Lisa, you've worked with companies that are very well resourced and are large, not getting a startup, not getting their start. And so I'd like to know, what's your view on what's working and what's not when it comes to cyber risk management from your perspective?
Great, thanks, Boyden. I think part of the challenge is appropriately contextualizing cyber risk. With financial risks such as credit, market, and liquidity, it's a binary discussion when determining your risk appetite, risk tolerance, and thresholds. And when losses start to approach your level of risk tolerance, you can take actions to move back in within your appetite. This is much more complex within operational risk domains such as cyber, where it's much more qualitative. Now, there are models, as Lisa mentioned, which can be leveraged to better quantify risk, along with approaches to aggregate controls in order to develop your key risk indicators, whether it aligns with your vulnerability management program, your MITRE attack framework and kill chains. There is work we need to do as an industry to make this more of a science than an art. Currently, anchoring on best practices and best practice frameworks such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and maturity models such as the FFIEC or Federal Financial Institutions Examinations Council cyber assessment tool, they can help you determine your inherent risk profile, such as what are your delivery channels, what are the external threats to your firm, technologies and connection types, to what actions that need to be taken in order to get to an acceptable level of residual risk, such as risk governance, threat intelligence, preventative and detective controls, and third-party risk. So it's a polarity that we see as we balance the right investments to reduce risk and have taking an aggregation of a couple of different approaches and models to calibrate residual risk for your firm.
Great, super. Now, Alma, I wanted to shift to you to talk about the federal perspective for a second. The FISMA, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act requires that agencies implement cybersecurity based on assessments of impact and risk. So, technically valid cybersecurity control implementations could be entirely or partially inappropriate if not aligned to risk identification, especially when you look at multiple layers of organization or mission process or information system levels. Have you seen this play out in your agency? And if so, do you have some suggestions?
Yeah, there's definitely pitfalls there. Like everyone else, it's really, really critical for us to be able to establish our risk tolerance for our organization, and then sometimes even a system by system risk tolerance, because obviously we have high value assets. Not every system needs to be protected to the same level as others, but at the same time, we have a weakest link issue where if we let our defenses down too much in any one particular area, that can cause an avenue for an attacker to be able to get in and to be able to gain a foothold in our environment and potentially pivot to a more high value system. So even when we look across, let's say DHS, an organization like that, CBP, where we're the largest law enforcement agency in the federal civilian large law enforcement agencies in the country, we have a lot greater risk tolerance than someone like a FEMA might. And what's interesting is as we're talking to our partners out in the field, for most organizations, confidentiality is the biggest thing that they'll emphasize when it comes to confidentiality, availability, or integrity for their data. And certainly we have a lot of extremely sensitive data that we are very, very concerned with protecting. But when we get out into the field, actually we talk a lot about availability, about being able to build in resiliency and ensuring that when we actually mitigate our systems, when we apply appropriate security controls, when we apply appropriate operating procedures, that we're doing something, we're laying a foundation to ensure that those systems are available when they need them to be there from an officer safety perspective, but also that they're available for the traveling public. So we're not holding up people who are trying to enter or leave the country, or all of the trade and travel that we're doing for supporting everything international, products coming into the ports and everything else that we do. So we definitely have a lot of efforts that we put towards assuring that those systems will be there, be operational, and also the integrity aspect, that they will be able to trust the data that's coming off of those systems. When it comes to, again, how we establish that risk tolerance, the one big pitfall that I think FISMA has seen is we apply controls in a system-by-system basis. Now, we've come a long way with actually assuring that we are looking at inherited controls, and that's an efficiency gain for us, because we can inherit controls from a larger GSS system, a global security control system. We can inherit from the cloud, from FedRAMP systems and things like that, and that can help us to reach actual formal authorization to operate faster. But more importantly, we need to be able to have an overall enterprise-wide view of our complete security posture, instead of getting stuck and looking at sort of the trees of the system-by-system controls versus missing the forest of how are we actually securing our enterprise at that highest level. So I do think that right now, while all the right elements are there to ensure we're applying controls at that most granular level, we just have to make sure that we're also sticking our head up above the trees and seeing that whole enterprise view at the same time.
That's interesting, Alma. How do you measure if you're making progress or not, or how do you measure your organization's maturity on this?
Yeah, so we actually have to, again, I think we augment FISMA with what we do. So I am a big fan also of the NIST risk management framework when it comes to laying out your cybersecurity program in the form of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. I think that shows you a different view of how your controls are applied. We're also doing things like Shaun mentioned, the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So we're constantly doing gap analysis against MITRE ATT&CK framework. But also when it comes to having an overall risk register we've built up, we take feeds and inputs from all over our cybersecurity program. And that can be all the formal certification and accreditation work, our ongoing vulnerability management work, our penetration testing. We now support our penetration testing with several public bug bounty programs that we've had in the last 2 years, which have been a real benefit and something that obviously scales really, really well, where we can bring in a huge high level of expertise that's laser focused on a particular problem that can come in and give us very targeted, high quality results for really a very good benefit. Also, anything that we're learning from our incidents as we go back and assess what went wrong and what do we need to do to make sure we don't have those same incidents again. We have a very active cyber threat intelligence program now that takes input from both classified, unclassified information, partners across the federal civilian space. CISA obviously is a huge partner for us in feeding us lots of high quality, actionable intelligence information. Also, anything that we're getting from our overall security architecture initiatives and gaps to identify there. And basically any place else where we actually find those gaps, we want to take them, bring them into that overall risk register for the enterprise level. And we have a methodology to then rack and stack all those various items so we can assure that we know what the biggest enterprise things that risks are and that we're addressing those in an appropriate manner.
That was super, Alma. Shaun, do you have anything to add to that you that you do at Discover now to help measure to help discover if you are maturing in your efforts to manage risk?
Absolutely. And Alma really hit on many, or if not all, of the key best practice components that we see across the industry. And I would submit that cyber defense risk management, it's really industry agnostic, sector agnostic, where the same principles apply. I would submit, how do we move toward a more of an assured risk state? In a sense, when we think about zero trust, we think about taking advantage of cloud native activities with immutable and ephemeral assets with known configurations, and you restore back to default or known good configuration. There are a lot of, we're seeing an evolution in the environment to where we can move from this position of playing whack-a-mole as we detect, respond, but then we still need to ensure that we're doing the basics in that, whether it's these exchange 0Ds we've seen recently, and we're seeing more advanced attacks such as SolarWinds, where supply chain issues, identity issues. How do we continue to move toward an assured state in an environment which has such an expansive posture? Some of those capabilities, as Alma mentioned, and continuing to build there, which I'm sure we all are moving toward this more of an assured state to the extent possible, but it's a continuous calibration as we evaluate in a rapidly evolving threat environment.
Great. Thank you, Shaun. And Lisa, are any of these topics resonating with the group that you speak with? Do you have any comments to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with both Shaun and Alma. Obviously, scale-wise, when you're dealing with seed all the way up to, what we categorize Series A, Series B, so, earlier stage companies, they have their own maturation of frameworks that they can adopt and how fast they can adopt them. But again, as I shared, we're only investing in cybersecurity, so these folks are already pretty expert in understanding, how to leverage, the MITRE, the NIST framework, and are dealing with, basically designing from the start security in mind.
Awesome, great. Well, I want to shift gears for a minute. It wouldn't be a cybersecurity risk discussion if we didn't talk about insurance, cyber insurance. And so I want to bring this question to start with you, Lisa, again. What are your views on cyber insurance as part of the risk management equation?
Well, thanks, Boyden. I think it's really a reflective of the state of the cyber environment right now. I mean, the cyber insurance market was $7 billion last year and is projected to go to 2025 with 20 billion, and some analysts are saying 50 billion. Wow. I mean, that's astronomical. Almost 10 times the number of claims were written in the last 3 years. And there's over 500 insurers now writing specifically cyber insurance claims. But as you can imagine, this is all being driven by board level awareness, the SolarWinds hack, reputational risk, and all of these things are quite interesting from a venture capital standpoint, because if we look at the companies that have been invested in, we've seen that maybe 200 million has been invested in this market, and we have already seen several unicorns. And so unicorns are those startup companies, those companies that are valued at over $1 billion already in this market. So I think, again, the challenges for insurers are real insurance companies' greatest concerns include, how do they define appropriate pricing mechanisms? How do they get agreement of policies across states, countries? And the areas of cyber, risk being invested in for insurers are threat intelligence, education, artificial intelligence so that they can do better underwriting, data protection monitoring. And then for the enterprises, for those who want cyber insurance, they've got to show that they have a cyber risk management framework, that they're adhering to it, that they're practicing and executing against it. They're going to have to do that annually if they want to keep the policy. And if they show any, hygiene risk, weakness, they're going to have to fix it to keep the policy in place. So it's really interesting because it's an emerging market, but it's a market that's almost showing that there's more demand than capacity for the insurers to fill right now.
That's really interesting, Lisa. Shaun, how do you see cyber insurance fitting into the cyber risk equation?
Thank you, Boyden. Cyber insurance, I believe it's important to have. I think bottom line, as we think about it from a control, it's a risk transfer activity, and it can be perceived as that in the event of an incident. But I would submit it is not a panacea in protecting the firm from such secondary losses, whether that's reputational risk, whether it's legal risk. It does a great job of covering a lot of your primary losses in the event you had an incident. But when we think about cyber attacks, it's almost like it follows a pattern of epidemiology where if not contained early, it can spread and become very expensive, very massive, and there are limits to insurance. I think it's an important tool in your risk reduction, risk transfer toolkit, but certainly not a panacea. And and not a replacement for investing in your cyber program, managing your control and exposure posture across your firm.
Mm-hmm. And Alma, not something that the federal government or as an agency CISO that you're able to get cyber risk and cyber insurance for your agency, but I'm curious if you have other ideas of transferring risk, or if it has a role for the organizations that are your vendors who might be getting it.
I thought you were my cyber insurance if something went wrong. So
it's perfect.
Getting there. No, I mean it is definitely different. We have a different role to play, and obviously loss is also different for us, and we're not looking at market share and things like that. So no, I'm not aware of any federal agencies having it. It'll be interesting to see if that is something that develops, because I will use SolarWinds as an example, and so I'm sure like the buzzwords, the drinking game for this conference has got to be zero trust and SolarWinds, and I'm not sure what other buzzwords are going to be there, but those two are definitely going to be there. But even with CISA, I think you've seen a lot of organizations that have had to pick up the phone and call external entities to help to assist with that breach response. And so I think that does beg the question that probably needs to happen at the CISA level and above that, about what should the role be about do we scale something federal government wide, where if CISA needs to augment a lot of its support, or if agencies need more support, is there a good pipeline or contract or something else through like QSMO, for example, that CISA is setting up to be able to get some of that support? I think it is on QSMO, isn't it, for some of the response initiatives?
Yeah, let me just pause there for the folks in the audience. The QSMO acronym stands for Quality Service Management Office, of a part of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency's offerings to basically make available the federal government's buying power in shared services and other standardizing on a quality standard for different services across the federal government. It's a good point. But we are exploring a cyber response fund similar to the FEMA has via the Stafford Act. So that is something that's being conceived of right now. But back to you, Alma.
Yeah, no, definitely a lot of discussion about a lot of different parts of DHS like FEMA and how they should play when you have these major cyber response requirements. So I guess you'd mentioned other parties. It's probably a good time. I mentioned SolarWinds, probably a good time to bring up third-party risk. That's definitely something that we absolutely have as a concern. And so it could be a factor of someone's overall risk score when we're dealing with, whether we're dealing with suppliers, someone in the supply chain like a SolarWinds, or contractors who are providing us personnel, or we tend to not want to do a whole lot of off-site processing of our data out on systems that aren't, let's say, our own systems. But that's a scenario that a lot of agencies do. And so I would think that they would have to make sure that within their contracts, that might be something that they would look for, to ensure that they have adequate security to start with, that those requirements are all built into their contracts, and perhaps that they have clauses in there where they can reach out and quickly grab additional support to surge if it's required in response to an incident. We are looking at a lot of those challenges with how we actually measure risk for all these entities that we are now doing business with, connecting. So I've been with DHS in one form or another, for the last 15 years or so. And when we first came in, from an attack perspective, I could say that we saw a lot more direct attacks on us. We still see obviously direct attacks, but I think a lot of the attacks, all the volume that we have seen, I believe has shifted to the people we do business with, because I think that's often a softer target. So now again, now if they're seeing that as a way to get into us or to get to the same data that we might hold, now we have this big concern about how do we raise everyone else up to a higher standard, and how do we validate whether or not they are properly mitigating their cyber risk before we do business with them in some instances. And the thing is, we have some teams that can go out and assess key partners for high value assets, or we have, a lot of sensitive data that might be out there that a third party does have to handle. But that doesn't scale towards everyone that we need to talk with. So we've brought in some third-party entities to be able to do some of the risk scoring for third parties. Shaun's actually referred some companies to us. We found some other companies as well. Great. So we can get that sort of credit score for cyber risk from these companies. Certainly whether or not they have cyber insurance could be an element of that risk. But we are looking now again how we grow that program for third-party risk, and without having to be everywhere and assess everyone directly, have more of that attestation, similar to what the Department of Defense is talking about with the CMMC standard. DHS is very interested in that overall. We've already had some discussions with DoD about how we could potentially adopt that into our contracts. We're obviously not there like today, but it's something that I could see coming very soon as a way to, I think, ensure that we're all meeting some sort of a high standard and can really have some sort of attestation and validation of that we aren't having to necessarily do ourselves all the time.
Yeah,
I would add that.
Absolutely. Please, Shaun.
Okay. On the insurance piece, I'm not sure if I could imagine a company underwriting the U.S. government, and that's going to be more of in an appropriations bill or going back to the Treasury. But the third-party risks that Alma highlights there, it's exactly the same in the industry as well, where you have a lot of the larger firms that have built up a robust control posture. Is it perfect? Nothing's perfect, but it's going through the weakest link. Why should I burn a 0 day if I can go get in through the neighbor's house to you? And how do we ensure we have a view, whether it's an external exposure footprint, that's an indicator of what they're, if the outside of the house is dirty, you have a high level of confidence that the inside of the house has some challenges as well. And then how do you ensure that you have rapid mechanisms to either ensure your data is protected, whether that's tokenization, you manage the access, you can look at behavioral, any type of Bayesian type models to look at behavior within your environment to mitigate those risks as soon as possible. But similar challenges that Alma is facing as well.
Yes, one of the sort of indelicate phrases I like to refer to when we're talking about cybersecurity is that sort of proverbial, if you encounter a bear in the woods with your friend, you don't need to run faster than the bear, you just need to run faster than your friend. And I think that is sort of appropriate when it comes to cybersecurity a little bit, because you want to be not the lowest hanging fruit for the adversary, to your point about getting into the department not directly, but going through third parties and things like that. So I'm curious, any thoughts on knowing your status relative to your peers, yet also there's so many interdependencies. You do want the tide to rise all ships. Any comments?
Yeah, so
It
definitely.
is, we are moving. Oh, please.
Go ahead, Shaun.
It certainly is a collective defense environment, which is what excites me about the work with the FSISEC, at least for the financial services sector. How do we ensure rapid intelligence sharing? And that's a lot of the work you do at CISA, for the DHS and federal government. But how do we ensure a broader collective defense approach where we can have rapid sharing of indicators of compromises, of hashes, of other threat intelligence and tippers? So if we see anybody walking the fence line in our perimeter, we can start to raise up and highlight that type of activity. So our other colleagues and partners, while we compete against each other in financial markets, we still work together to ensure we have collective defense and we can share information, have rapid response across the sector.
Great, Alma.
Yeah, I can't imagine doing this job without having the input of my fellow CISOs from across the federal government, and especially, of course, inside DHS and the other major components. We've had a really, really good partnership to be able to, we do have a common scorecard. So we can see, like, relatively speaking, where everyone is sitting with a lot of the key metrics, especially around vulnerability management and configuration management and our status with authorizing systems and how many systems we're running. But obviously, we have a lot of ongoing dialogue too, amongst each other about, well, how are we doing this? What tools are you using? How can we improve the way that our security operations centers share information? What's the real, even discussions about risk? So when we have things like SolarWinds, or we have a collective group where we can actually ask each other, okay, well, what is the risk of doing this, and what are the best alternatives for actually dealing with that? You have to have a community and somebody else you can hold yourself up against. Otherwise, you would just really have no way to even say whether or not you're good. And maybe that leads to a false sense of security, or just as bad, I think, could be overspending, overdoing some of your security. Where you're locking down systems, spending a lot of money, that you don't need to spend, making life more difficult for your users than it needs to be. It's definitely a balancing act, and without that feeler, I don't think you're gonna be able to get that exactly right. We'll leave it at that.
Oh, super. Well, I wanted to get us thinking about the future a little bit now. We've talked a lot about the things that we've done so far that have worked, some areas that we've learned lessons, that we have recommendations for the future, and I want to sort of pivot us to wrap up with some projections on where we think the cyber risk discussion is going to be going in the future. And I want to give the first word to Lisa, because of all of us, I think she's probably got the best aptitude for betting on winners here. And so I wanted to take advantage of your ability to look in the crystal ball. Lisa, any projections for where the risk discussion is going for cyber?
Well, I'll start with this, right? And as we all know, the digitization of business has just accelerated through pandemic, right? And we're not going to be going back. And so, which in turn has put additional pressure on every single company, from their cyber risk posture to their resiliency plans. And frankly, my prediction is that customers, consumers, and citizens, right, expect that companies and government are going to view cyber as an important part of their value proposition. And companies and government should leverage that. And if folks, don't feel that way, and citizens don't feel that way, they're going to vote not only with their wallets, but they're going to vote literally with their votes.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. Alma, to you.
So we're going to be doing lots and lots of outsourcing, lots more managed services, software as a services. So we're going to be spreading our risk out a lot amongst other third parties, whereas normally we'd want to do that all ourselves. but that just doesn't scale, and we can't be experts in all of those things. So, our attitude towards risk in the federal government has to shift to adapt to those new models. There are huge benefits for doing it, and it makes life a lot better. But again, we can't go and hug servers anymore and have sort of the same a sense of ownership of every single thing that we do. Going beyond that, automation, obviously, we're going to continue to lean on that. That is hugely transformative how we do security operations. Part of that automation is obviously the implementation of zero trust, which again, I've spoken on I think 5 zero trust panels in the last month. Everyone wants to talk about zero trust. And it's an old concept, really, because it's really just least privilege, but it's actually executing that to the nth degree and doing it correctly. And now we have the tools and the capabilities to actually do that right. And then finally, as Shaun said, moving from some of the security models of protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability to where we're doing the DIE model, right? Which is another thing that comes from RSA, distributed, immutable, and ephemeral for all the services. So we're creating services that we can sacrifice, that we know can get blown away and can come up in a pristine state, that we have distributed. So they're load balanced, they're resilient, they're fault tolerant. Building systems where it doesn't really matter if a compromise happens, because that's just something that goes away essentially in an instant, and we keep going without being slowed down at all. So between those models and the full embrace of zero trust, I think we're really on the edge of something really big in security that will be game changing for all of us.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who aren't familiar to what Alma is referring, DIE, just Google Sunil Yu's talk at RSA from last year. You want to have more cattle, less pets. I'll leave it at that and pass it over to Shaun to give us your prediction.
Yep, I mean, really, my teammates, Lisa and Alma, hit it on the head. I think this environment, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And while we may have better models to have improved risk quantification, we take advantage of some of the principles that Alma and Lisa have highlighted. We're going to see more challenges. We see a rapid evolving environment. When you think about your typical domains, warfighting domains, air, sea, space, and land, they're really it's finite. Physics can constrain it. You can only turn a fighter jet so many G's before the craft starts to break apart. And so when you think about cyber at the intersection of all these domains, it's a man-made domain. It's malleable. The dimensions are changing. As soon as we iterate and continue to lock down, I think we're going to see a new evolution of these types of attacks. But how do we ensure that we anchor on the core principles mentioned by my teammates and continue to push that forward and ensure that we have immediate response, again, the immutability, automation, simplification, which is critical as we continue along this exciting environment that's going to become more complex, and how do we continue to maintain those principles and prevent and reduce risk to our firms, organizations, and our government. Thank you.
I love that, Shaun. I think of Occam's razor, keeping it simple, the excellent phrase. Folks, thank you for tuning in today for our panel on cyber risk management. It's been my pleasure to be here with Lisa Donnan, Shaun Khalfan, and Alma Cole. Thanks to each one of you for your time and your expertise on this topic. If you are interested in learning more about cyber risk management, I encourage you in the audience to head on over to CISA.gov to check out the resources that we have available to all critical infrastructure owners and operators. And we look forward to responding all to your questions in the chat today. Thank you, everyone.